Welcome to this live stream from Windows on the World, windowsontheworld.net. We do a new show every Sunday, 8 p.m. UK time. And this show is going to be a very interesting one. We're going to get into the bigger picture of history, because history is not of much use to us unless we can glean something from it. And by glean something from it, I mean that we need to integrate that history into our knowledge system. So tonight's show is not about religion, but more about experience and the word religio. And we're going to get onto that very soon. But everything is governance. How do you govern yourself? How do you let yourself be governed? These are really important questions. And that has to come into some kind of philosophy. And if there's no philosophy and learning behind actions, then those actions are robotic. And in this age of bio-robotization, and people are being turned into bio-robots, then this is to be avoided, because the result of bio-robotization is going to be extinction of those people who follow it. So those people who follow the distractions and the things which are put into their path, which are of no use to them, then that is a way of becoming extinct. So is what you do fully conscious? Are you fully conscious? Is everything you do integrated on a high level? And that's what we're going to be really talking about in this show tonight. And I've talked quite a lot about the ancient order of Druidry, the ancient order of knowledge, and the ancient Christianity, which has been in the British Isles for much longer than the Romans are leading us, or did lead us, to believe. So it's very important that we know what principles we are going to adhere to and what information we put into our heads and what the outcomes of that information are. So if we put in false information, then they're going to lead us into groups, and these groups of people will form what they call egregors. In other words, delusions. It's a little bit like when children are playing and using their imaginations, and say they're pretending to be a knight on horseback with a sword, and you go and say, no, that's just a cardboard box and a stick. That is a big blow to the childish imagination. But there's people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who are still at that stage where they have something in their imagination which has nothing to do with the external reality. There is nothing wrong with having an imagination. Imagination is great as long as it's integrated into our system of learning. So that's what really this show is going to be about. So we did a show called What is Divine Providence? And divine providence is when you are fully aligned with the right actions. And I'm not talking about some kind of new age philosophy here. I'm not talking about the idea that people manifest their own reality, this word manifesting, and the other new age terms. These are delusional. They lead people into those egregors. So when we take ourselves away from this idea of short-term gratification and look at long-term learning, that does cause a shift in the information field. And it means that you are preparing yourself for information which can be used over a lifetime. And that to me is the most interesting aspect of learning. For instance, people talk about gurus. Guru is a teacher. It means to bring from the dark into the light. Most people who call themselves gurus are frauds and fakes. But I had a teacher once who was a real guru. Didn't call himself a guru, but he taught me technique. It was actually opera singing. And I spent 7 to 8 years with this teacher, because he said to me, it takes 7 years for you to do this. This is the Italian method of singing. And he was taught by Gilli, the opera singer, and he used to teach at Covent Garden Opera House. And I got to know this fella. And he was a real teacher. But when I think about it, how many real teachers have I had in my life? Because I always go back to thinking about him, because he knew exactly what he was talking about and he could convey that information. So when we find someone like that, we call them a teacher. And so tonight's show is going to be about teachers. So we're going to be talking about the history of ancient Britain. We're going to be talking about Jesus and Joseph of Arimathea. And all of this stuff is in the historical record. But that's not the important bit. The important bit is, again, what we glean from it. So those who do not have this appetite for distraction are more able to take on long-term learning. And that's what really this show and all the shows are about. They're about this idea that this is a lifelong learning project, and that learning project is something that I'm just sharing with the less than 3% who will actually appreciate it. As we said in last week's show, when they say 97% of scientists agree, what they mean is that only 3% or less of information is actually allowed out. So we have to look very hard for information. So I'm going to start off with the first paragraph of Jerusalem by William Blake. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountain green? And was the holy Lamb of God on England's pastures seen? And this is the question we're going to be asking. And Blake actually wrote Jerusalem in 1804, but he didn't finish it until 1820. And it was a prologue to his epic poem, Milton. But the poem itself is evocative. I like the first 4 lines of it and the last 4 lines of it, and they get to the point. So the shows that we're going to be referring to in tonight's show, which may be of interest to you, are Druids and Celtic Civilization, The Age of the Druids, The Ancient Faith, Truth Keepers, and The Lost Order of Knowledge. And you can find an article called The Lost Order of Knowledge on the homepage at Windows on the World. And tonight's not going to be just a potted history, but a meaningful overview. So, as we know, the truth has never been popular. And that has been something which I've noticed over the past several years. And what I find interesting about this is that the fork in the road after that big event, COVID, and the reset, has actually been the most illuminating thing that's happened for 20 to 30 years, probably more. Because what it did was it sorted out people who could really think for themselves. And people who had a little bit of knowledge followed false teachers. And so I made it the sort of business of this show to try and get rid of those sort of people and bring people in who wanted to learn. And that, again, is really tying in to all this stuff I've been putting out. If that sounds a bit vague, then we have to think about what knowledge really is. And I've been looking at these ancient civilizations, such as the Druids, and they seem to have coexisted with this early Christianity. So the show is not about religion, it's about religio, which is actually the experience. Now, religio is the direct divine experience that one gets when one has integrated, fully integrated knowledge. And the word religio was very common in the times of the Romans. However, it was actually taken out of the vocabulary when the Roman Church took control, because the Roman Church wanted to take control of that information and use that information field to become intermediaries. As they said in Unum Sanctum by 1302, but well before that, but they actually announced it in 1302, that there was no salvation outside their cult. So the Roman cult became the absolute intermediary between you and God. Therefore, the term religio was never heard of again, because religio was the direct experience, which after that time you were not allowed to have, or they preferred you not to have it. So when we go back to the early Christians and the power that they had and the force that was feared by people who opposed them, then that's what this is really about. It's about the direct experience and knowledge. And Ritual and Religion is one of the shows that you can look at, and also The Perfected Mind Field. And we covered that in those shows. It was a new way of putting this information across. And it's actually very helpful. That's why I put this stuff out there, because it's for me to go back over as well. So basically, the church became an empty shell, and now it is full of mediocrities and steered by agents of change. So we don't need to be talking about the church when we're talking about Christianity and the ancient Christianity of the way. Providence is what it was all about. The idea of having divine providence, walking with divinity. And this is what happens when information is actually integrated. So the way was a force that the neurotics of control and man-made ritual actually despised. And of course, the early Christians were feared and envied and hated by the Pharisees because they wanted their neurosis, their man-made religion, to be the power that people feared and respected. So again, the middleman taking control, and the battle between those who live by truth versus those who impose law for ritual and control was what the whole story of Jesus and the apostles, the disciples, was all about. And that's what this show is really all about. So I'm going to give you first a reference to Christians, which is in the King James Bible. It's in Acts 11:26. And it came to pass that a whole year they assembled themselves within the church and taught much people. And the disciples were called Christians, and they were first in Antioch. So let's ask this question. When were the first Christians in Britain? Well, it seems that they were there a lot earlier than we are led to believe. Of course, there is the cover story of Augustine in 597 AD converting King Ethelbert in Kent. Absolute garbage. And we can actually go back to Roman sources to prove that. So we know that the 597 AD is way too late. And of course, all the old ancient churches, which were probably, and in many cases, I think it can be proven that they were on druidical sites or very ancient sites. Well, those churches are said to have been around from 600 AD onwards. So we've been covering Britain's Shattered Isles, which suggests that there was an advanced civilization for a very long time in Britain. And we're going to give you some Roman sources on that, which will go along with this information for tonight's show. So yes, William Comyns Beaumont, we've covered his stuff quite a lot. Have a look at Britain's Shattered Isles. It really does give a good case for Britain not only being civilized before the Romans, but being very advanced. And we're told that the Druids and the early Christians were kind of different. It appears, though, when we look into it and those shows we've done recently, that this wasn't the case. And they not only coexisted, but Christianity was absorbed. And that is very interesting. Of course, then we get the Anglo-Saxons coming in 700 to 800s, and that was a disruption again. But just like in the time of the Romans, Christianity never disappeared in Britain. And we're going to give some examples of why that is. So, yes, there's a show called Ritual and Religion. Have a look at that. And the force they fear. This is very important when we want to know about the early Christianity. So I'm going to give you now a quote from Diodorus Siculus in 60 BC when he talked about the Britons. He said, "They are plain and upright in their dealings and far from the craft and subtlety of our countrymen. The Celts are open, invite strangers into their homes and banquets, and afterwards ask their guests about their business." So was Britain the first country to accept the original Christianity? This is the question. And we can go now to King Lucius, who proclaimed Britain to be Christian at the National Council of Winchester in 156 AD. So here we have the official sources. And by 208 AD, Tertullian stated, "The Christian church extended to all the boundaries of Gaul and to parts of Britain inaccessible to the Romans, but subject to Christ." Well, this is very interesting, isn't it? Because we're told that the Druids were mainly in Gaul, and then we find out that their main base was in the British Isles. And of course, they had bases on Mona, or Anglesey, as it's called now, Isle of Wight, and the Isle of Man. And it seems that the head of the priesthood was in the British Isles, and you can go back to our shows on that about Druids and ancient Christianity. So we can go to Eusebius now in the 4th century. And I'll just get this up because it's needing to be put onto the screen. Not quite sure what's happened here. I'll be looking at those. The chatting a bit. It's great, actually. I can see it from here. Okay, so let's go now to Eusebius in the early 4th century. The apostles passed beyond the ocean to the isles called the Britannic Isles. Very interesting. And we're going to be tying this in to Joseph of Arimathea and Jesus visiting Somerset, and of course the tin mines of Cornwall. Now, many people know these stories, but when we put them into the bigger picture, then it starts to get very interesting. Let's now go back to the Romans. The Council of Arles was in 314. The Council of Nicaea was 325. The Council of Constantinople was 337. And the Bishop of Rome, during all this time, had no special precedence over the Christian church in Britain. And that is something that's very important, because then we can look at the later impositions of the Catholic Church to see how the cult absolutely controlled the narrative. I'm going to read now from a document by Malcolm Bowden. Well, it's not by him, but he found it. And I've been trying to find the origin of this document, but I couldn't find it. So I'm going to quote it anyway. But it's from 1517. And it states that the churches of France and Spain must yield in points of antiquity and precedence to that of Britain, as the latter church was founded by Joseph of Arimathea immediately after the Passion of Christ. So the question is, did Joseph of Arimathea bring young Jesus to the West Country? This was the area around Somerset and especially Glastonbury, which was not under Roman rule, which is very, very important, because many people still think that the Romans ruled the whole of Britain. They didn't. There were autonomous regions, and the area around Somerset and Glastonbury was an autonomous Christian region. So after the crucifixion, we have to ask, did Joseph flee the persecution of the Romans again, getting away from the Pharisees and their Sanhedrin, and did he return to Britain? So the question is, did Britain host both Joseph of Arimathea and Jesus? So once around the age of 14, Jesus attended Britain with Joseph of Arimathea. And the other side of it is that Joseph returned 20 years later, around 37 AD. And here we have the setting up of the first church in Britain, allegedly. We don't know that, of course, but it is known that the church in Glastonbury was set up between 30 to 37 AD. Some places say 30 AD, some say 37 AD. And that Joseph, when he returned, had 11 others with him. And he climbed up Weary Old Hill in Glastonbury, where you can see the Glastonbury Tor from. And this was at the age of 69, according to the history that I've been looking at. And he planted a hawthorn bush, and it's said to have been peculiar to Palestine. So they say that this particular strain wasn't very common in Britain. And it was destroyed by the Roundheads in 1643. That's really when things started to go properly wrong, isn't it? But it did grow back, and it was still there until December the 8th, 2010. This is interesting, because I believe that these sites that were of particular importance and had very high power and inspiration around them have been degraded. We can certainly see that in that particular area of Glastonbury, but the Glastonbury Thorn was chopped down. This is from The Guardian in 2010. And it says Glastonbury Thorn chopped down as town rages over attack on famous trees. It may have looked like a scrubby bush high on the bare slope of a hill in Somerset, but it was one of the most famous trees in England, and once one of the most famous in all Christendom, and it has been felled by vandals. The attack left the crown trailing to the ground beside the almost severed trunk of the Glastonbury Thorn, and it's said to have flowered on Weary Old Hill every Christmas day for 2,000 years, since Joseph of Arimathea thrust his staff into the hill which he brought from the Holy Land, and the tree blossomed. I would suggest that he planted it there symbolically. The day of the attack was 8th of December 2010. May have been chosen for its special significance each year on that day, because a sprig is cut from a tree in St. John's churchyard, grown from a cutting from that particular thorn, the one on the hill, and it's sent to the Queen to decorate her Christmas dinner table. And that happens every year. King Charles got one, actually, this last Christmas. Well, the director of Glastonbury Abbey said, "It's a great shock to everyone in Glastonbury. The landscape of the town has changed overnight. The mindless vandals who have hacked down this tree have struck at the heart of Christianity." But a cutting of it remains outside St. John's Church in Glastonbury High Street. And there is another bush which is within the Abbey. But the New Age takeover of Glastonbury may have something to do with the war on the way, which is the power of the early Christianity. You have to remember that everything is steered, infiltrated, and taken over or destroyed. And that has been the theme of a lot of our shows. And it doesn't matter whether it's philosophical, spiritual, or for direct governing purposes, then everything has been accounted for. I'm going to give you now some memories of Jesus in Glastonbury and other places too, which I've visited, which is fascinating. Before I do that, I just wanted to tell you something, that I was in that area of Somerset for quite a long time. And I always thought it had this magnificent energy to it. And I always felt great there. When I went to other counties, that kind of dissipated. So there was something particular about Somerset, which I found extremely inspiring. Always felt in a good mood there. And that's an interesting thing, because we're talking about memories of Christ around that area in Glastonbury, Priddy, Pilton, which where I spent quite a long time there, Looe, St. Just, Falmouth, St. Day, and Redruth. That's down in Cornwall. So there's memories of him there. By memories, what we actually mean really are stories. But this is the oral tradition. So people have memories that are passed down. And also, Joseph visited the tin mines at Brawes, which is a tin mine between Chasewater and St. Day. You can look them up on the map. In a letter to Pope Gregory, St. Augustine states that there was a church constructed by no human art, but divinely constructed, or by the hands of Christ himself, for the salvation of his people. So they're making these big claims here, but I think there's something to it, because when we look at the dates we're given and the history that we've been given by the Romans, then we have to be at least skeptical of that. So the historian Gildas said Jesus' lights and precepts of Jesus were afforded to this island during the last year of the reign of Tiberius, which was, I think, around 27 AD. Well, William of Malmesbury includes in his writings the contents of a letter given to King Ina in Glastonbury in 700 AD. This is a lot later, but it's still quite helpful. So the ancient church situated in the place called Glastonbury, described as being known to the great high priest and chiefest minister, formerly through his own ministry and that of angels. The Doomsday Survey also, this is a Doomsday Survey of the time, also records Jesus' presence in Glastonbury. King Arviragus gave 12 hides of land to Joseph of Arimathea and his 11 followers when he arrived in England in 37 AD. And they never had to pay tax on these lands. They were gifted to Joseph and his disciples, the people who came with him. So that was 12 hides of land which were never taxed by the king, which I think is quite symbolic. That's actually in the Doomsday Book. So that is a very good point of reference, I think. Yeah, it says that he never paid tax. So documents claiming Joseph to be Jesus's great uncle, they exist. There's one in the British Museum, and the catalogue number is HARL M55 38/59 F1936. And the second one is in Jesus College, Cambridge, and it's M520 in brackets 11-355. So those were courtesy of Malcolm Bowden, who did several videos on this subject, and you can look that up. So Joseph was not a Pharisee or a member of the Sanhedrin, but he was on the Provincial Roman Senate Advisory Council to Rome. And this was also known outside Britain, Britain was known as the Tin Isles or the Cassiodorites. And the stories which bring back this history include miners who say Christ came to the mines with Joseph, who was obviously a tin trader, and the tin was exported down the River Fal. Obviously, we've got to remember that the Phoenicians were trading with Britain way before this time, and the routes that they took we're going to get into also. But apparently he also landed at Loo, which was also known as Lamana in those times. This is now called Loo. And if you look on the map, they're all pretty close together. They're not very far away. So we've got Glastonbury and we've got the lower parts of Devon, Cornwall. So there's some local sayings around these areas. And this is really interesting because when I was around Priddy, Pilton, Glastonbury area, I did hear people say these things. One is, get your hair cut or people will think Joseph of Arimathea is back. And also, Lebanese Maronite Christians say Jesus went from Tyre on a trading ship staying in the winter on the shores of Britain due to bad weather. And fleeing Christians followed a route through Marseille, the Rhone Valley, Limoges to Morlaix Port, then across to Falmouth. So this was an actual route that was known. And it was known that persecuted Christians would come back to Britain. When I say back to Britain, because I'm trying to get this idea across that Christianity could well have started in Britain. I don't expect anyone to believe that. And I'm not here to push any belief system at all. This is all about knowledge and how to improve really integrated knowledge and how we look at the world. So yeah, and the Phoenicians' route to Britain was Tyre, Joppa, Narbonne, Marseille, Morlaix, Falmouth, around the Severn Estuary, into Glastonbury. Very important point here is that Glastonbury was underwater at that time. That area was flooded. Because if they call it the Somerset Levels, it still floods to this day. But the sea did come in that far. So it's quite possible that people came by boat to Glastonbury. And miners apparently used to sing a song called Joseph Was a Tin Man. And there's some other things that are really interesting. And they're called tunic crosses. And they're particular to certain areas in Cornwall, around the mining area, which of course is where Jesus and Joseph were allegedly spotted. And these are crosses they're like a Celtic Christian cross. They're quite enigmatic. There's a figure of a boy, and he's in this short tunic, but no one's ever explained who this boy is. Fascinating, isn't it? So, yeah, and at the parish church of Priddy, which is on the Mendips, they have an old saying. They say, in response to something, as sure as our Lord was at Priddy. So if you're trying to aver something that is true and you're saying, well, it's true as the sun coming up every morning, or whatever phrase you want to use. They used to say, as sure as our Lord was at Priddy. And a carol is sung at that place called Priddy too. And it starts off with the lines, Joseph was a tin merchant, a tin merchant, a tin merchant, and goes on to describe how they see him arriving in this boat. Quite interesting. So if the whole of the Christian world has been deceived, then ours shows the force they fear. And the work of William Comyns Beaumont, including this historical reinvention of Christianity by Constantine, and of course the fake religion that was put in its place, has really paved the way for further deception. A very great deception, really. And I'm going to now get into Queen Elizabeth I on religion. This is from 1559, and it's Queen Elizabeth's reply to an address from 5 Catholic bishops. And the reference for this, it was from G.B. Harrison, Letters of Queen Elizabeth in London. That's where the source of this. And it was also used in a book called The New Jerusalem by Adrian Gilbert, which was published in 2010. And I did some historical stuff with Adrian, actually. We did go into the real King Arthur. And that was very interesting too. I believe the King Arthur story, however, was really a Knights Templar creation at that particular time to get the holy wars to be more popular with a legendary knight, King Arthur. Let's get into what Elizabeth said in an address to 5 Catholic bishops who had written to her. Sirs, as to your entreaty for us to listen to you, we waive it. Yet do return you this our answer. Our realm and subjects have been long wanderers, walking astray whilst they were under the tuition of Roman pastors who advised them to own a wolf for their head in lieu of a careful shepherd, whose inventions, heresies, and schisms be so numerous that the flock of Christ have fed on poisonous shrubs for want of wholesome pastures. And whereas you hit us and our subjects in the teeth, that the Romish Church first planted the Catholic faith within our realms, the records and chronicles of our realms testify the contrary, and your own Romish idolatry maketh you liars. Witness the ancient monument of Gildas, unto which both foreign and domestic have gone in pilgrimage there to offer. This author testifieth Joseph of Arimathea to be the first preacher of the word of God within our realms. So Elizabeth I asserts that Joseph of Arimathea was the first preacher of the way in Britain. She carries on. Long after that, when Austin or St. Augustine came from Rome, this our realm had bishops and priests therein, as is well known to the wise and learned of our realm by woeful experience, how your church entered therein by blood, they being martyrs for Christ and put to death because they denied Rome's usurped authority. Very well said, I think. That was Elizabeth I there, giving us some more information about Jesus and Joseph in Glastonbury, and Britain being civilized and Christianized way before the Roman invasion had really got going. One thing is for sure, the whole purpose of the present dumbing down of everything is just to force compliance and to keep all future generations ignorant and intolerant of knowledge. This is from an article called The Order of Knowledge. And what it's really about is that those capable of understanding the bigger picture of knowledge can integrate this into their beliefs and get closer to not only their own divinity, but that of the Creator. Because something happens when you look at this sort of information, and that is the middlemen, the interlopers, and the disinformers actually disappear. And that's something, if anything, that I would share with you about my experience of retrospectively looking into this after I'd had that experience, if that makes any sense. So when I've done the shows about what is divine providence and attuning ourselves to the highest spiritual power, God, and learning about the real teachers that were probably more part of the history of the British Isles than we are led to believe, then surely that makes us much more knowledgeable about ourselves and the history that we've been told. And that's what it's really all about, because those capable of keeping knowledge should pass it on to those who are also capable but don't have the knowledge. So history is not just written by the winners, it's written by flat out liars. And well, I think the word propaganda is now too intelligent a concept for what's being put out there. And the main thing with these shows is that they're about opening up information so that you don't just get bits of history, you get something which hopefully will inspire you to look further. And the idea that there should be an organized group throughout the world came up in the Order of Knowledge. And the Order of Knowledge was really referring back to the times of Jesus and before the times of the Druids, which led up to Christianity in Britain, that there was an oral knowledge and culture that was very advanced, and people were much more integrated in their thinking and the way they are. So the idea of all this, if anything, is to take ourselves away from biorobotization, to understand providence, what that really means, and have our experiences which are not colored by belief systems which have been imposed. And it's a very fine line, this, because what you have to do, I think, is you attune yourself more and more. It's a little bit like rehearsing something or practicing something. You get better and better at it, and your radar will get better and better. And that is really the purpose of these shows about the early Christianity and the way and the ancient order of knowledge. So those who know where the predictable world governance agenda is going will now know the solutions, because the solutions are all there. And it's not only the actions that you take when you know how a system works, which is what I've been talking about for years, but it's your response to that system and how that system is set up. So once you know how a system's set up, you can get around it. And that's what the whole of the talking about the force they fear, which was the power the early Christians had, which was why the Pharisees hated them. Once you know this and you have an idea where it came from and are able to apply it to your daily life, then you do seem to get into providence. That seems to be the way things are. It seems to be an order to the way things are, and the order of knowledge is the way forward, I think. And if you'd like to contribute anything, or you have any historical information of interest, do contact me, info@windowsontheworld.net. So I'm going to have a quick look at these comments, and it's great. Yeah, I'm going to read them all later. I'll read all of the comments later. And I'm going to draw this to a close and thank everybody for tuning in tonight. There will be shows uploaded to Spreaker. I'm still using that channel. People are still downloading the shows from there. There's still over 400 shows in that archive. So do stay in touch through the website and I will read the comments. I'm going to be back here next Sunday. So hope you enjoyed that, and just check out the information that was in the stream. Thanks everyone for watching.